Today on Brief History, we take a look at a Queen of Britain who would be one of the longest reigning monarchs in British history. Growing up during the vice-driven reigns of her uncles, she would inherit the crown at the young age of 18 and begin her long and event-filled rule as queen. Her reign would see political turmoil, international war, a devastating loss, and a queen whose blood relations would span across all of Europe. Join me as I take a brief look at the last Hanoverian monarch of Britain, remembered today as Queen Victoria. Princess Alexandrina Victoria was born on May 24, 1819 at Kensington Palace in London, England. She was the daughter of a man named Edward, Duke of Kent and Strathern, and her mother was a woman named Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld. Before getting into Victoria's early life, it is important to take a step back and discuss the events leading up to her birth in order to understand the situation Victoria was born into and the implications of her birth. Victoria's grandfather was King George III, and he, over his life, produced a large brood of children, 15 in total. As the king aged, he was stricken with bouts of mental illness, which incapacitated him and forced the kingdom to be ruled by his eldest son, George, Victoria's uncle, who became regent for a time. The regent George had married and produced one living daughter named Charlotte, Victoria's cousin, who was seen as the future of the British monarchy. Charlotte was married to a man named Leopold of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld in 1816, but unfortunately she died in childbirth in 1817. This put the British royal family into a serious predicament. Although George III had produced a very large family, which included Victoria's father Edward, by the time of Princess Charlotte's death, none of them had produced legitimate heirs which could inherit the throne in the next generation. Furthermore, Victoria's uncle, the regent George, detested his wife, and so there was no chance of him producing another heir to the throne with her. Thus, this crisis prompted some of the sons of George III to marry with the intent of producing children. Victoria's father was, of course, one of these sons, and was wed to Victoria's mother at this time, the marriage quickly producing Victoria in 1819. Interestingly, Victoria's father's financial position, like many of his siblings, was poor at this time, so he and Victoria's mother actually traveled to Germany. Victoria was conceived in Germany, but her father did not want her to be born on the continent, so insisted that they travel back to England so that Victoria could be born there. An important thing to note is that the deceased Princess Charlotte's now widowed husband, Leopold, was Victoria's uncle, as he was Victoria's mother's younger brother. He will come up again shortly in Victoria's story. Other children of George III were also successful in producing children, such as Victoria's other paternal uncle, Ernest, Duke of Cumberland, but none of the siblings who were older than Victoria's father, Edward, were able to produce any. Thus, Victoria was the first of the next generation in line to the throne if and when her uncles died out. Her eldest paternal uncle, the at the time regent George, made a scene at Victoria's christening by raising a fuss about her name. George was ultimately the one who settled on the name Alexandrina Victoria, Alexandrina being a name which hearkened to and honored the Russian Tsar Alexander I. Thus, Victoria in her early childhood was not referred to as Victoria at all. In fact, she was often called by the nickname Drina, a shortened version of her first name. This, of course, changed once she became older, but it is nevertheless an interesting fact to point out. Unfortunately, 8 months after Victoria's birth in January 1820, her father fell ill and died. This loss left Victoria without a male father figure as she aged, and this would ultimately create a void in her life which she would continuously attempt to fill with other capable men, as we will see. In the same month that Victoria's father died, her ailing grandfather, King George III, who was living as a mentally ill recluse shut away at Windsor, also died, thus bringing the then regent, Prince George, Victoria's uncle, to the throne as King George IV. Victoria was settled in Kensington in England, although early on, there was a real chance that she might return to Germany with her mother. After her father's death, Victoria's mother inherited his disastrous financial situation and wanted to return to Germany with her daughter in order to lessen her financial strain, something that George IV was actually in favor of. Fortunately, Victoria's other uncle, discussed previously, Leopold, insisted that Victoria and her mother remain in England and paid for them to remain in London. Thus, it was thanks to Leopold that Victoria was raised as an English woman and not a German one. She was initially under the care of her mother and was vaccinated against smallpox in her early youth, but a governess was eventually installed who would play a major role in her future. Her name was Johanna Clara Louise Lehzen, known as Baroness Lehzen, and she will come up again shortly. A couple interesting things to note here is that Victoria had two half-siblings who had been born to her mother before she was widowed and remarried. Victoria would have a good relationship with her half-sister named Princess Fedora of Leiningen, although Fedora was eventually married off and sent away. Additionally, a midwife named Charlotte von Siebold assisted in Victoria's birth before she traveled back to Germany to assist in the birth of Victoria's first cousin, a young boy who would be named Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. Albert will come up again in a major way later in Victoria's story. Victoria continued to grow at Kensington and was said to have lived a very spoilt lifestyle, developing a serious temper which she would display throughout her life. She was entertained daily by dancing, parties, and music. Her uncle, the former regent, but now King George IV, warmed considerably towards his niece, as he was said to have had a soft spot for children. Victoria often had interviews with the king and was treated very kindly by him. By the time she was 4, she was learning her alphabet and getting a basic training in the subjects to come as she aged. Her governess, Baroness Lehzen, discussed previously, came into the picture when Victoria was 5, and Victoria was said to have adored her, despite the strict rule that Lehzen would often implement. But as Victoria aged, her studies slowed, as she found learning difficult and a bore. She was not said to have done well when it came to her schooling, with the exception of the arts like dancing and singing. Unfortunately for Victoria, this easy life as a child would change as she aged due to the influence of one man, Sir John Conroy. Conroy was the comptroller of Victoria's mother's household, and he and Victoria's mother worked together to try and put themselves in a position to attain power through Victoria if she were to become queen before she reached the age of 18. Victoria's mother hoped to become regent, while Conroy hoped to become Victoria's private secretary, which would essentially mean that the pair could wield power through Victoria as a puppet. Victoria was exposed to what Conroy had dubbed the Kensington system, which for all intents and purposes was a way of isolating Victoria from the royal family and the world at large. She was forbidden to have friends, forcing her to acquire a massive collection of dolls, which she attempted to use to replace this lack of friendship with her peers. She could not meet with someone without a third party present, and was eventually guarded day and night, oftentimes by her own mother, who would sleep in Victoria's room. The resentment began to grow towards her mother, and even more so towards Sir John Conroy, who she began to detest. In 1830, Victoria was 11, and this was the year that her uncle George IV died. Victoria's other uncle, the at the time Duke of Clarence, acceded to the British throne as King William IV, and things began to take an unfortunate turn at this point. That same year, Victoria was said to have been studying the history of the kings and queens of England when she finally came to the full realization that she would become queen after her uncle. She was reported to have famously said the phrase, "I will be good," at this time. Due to Victoria still being a minor, a regency plan was needed, so Parliament declared that her mother would indeed fill that role if Victoria became queen before she came of age. This elevated Victoria's mother, especially in her own mind, to a much higher status within the realm. In theory, relations should have been great between Victoria's mother and the new King William IV and his court after this designation, but the reality was that Sir John Conroy was whispering in the Duchess's ear that plots were afoot to destroy her chances at a regency. So unfortunately, Victoria's household and the royal court relations actually deteriorated significantly. Victoria's mother and Conroy worked with all their might to prevent Victoria from interacting with the king and his court, and began to take liberties that, understandably, outraged the new king. In 1832, Victoria set out on what was essentially a royal progress throughout the realm without royal permission. Although Victoria's uncle the king had in his youth held some Whig tendencies, By the time he had become king, he was more Tory in nature. The progress that Victoria was sent on throughout the realm saw her staying at Whig households, which only furthered the king's anger. William was no fool and sensed what was happening. Victoria's absence at court was not due to her own choices. In fact, she wished to be freed from the so-called Kensington system, but for now there was no escaping it. Two events really set the tone for the next chapter of Victoria's life. In 1835, Victoria went on a progress in the north and traveled to Ramsgate, where she met up with her uncle Leopold, who by that time had become the king of the Belgians. While in Ramsgate, she fell ill with typhoid, a serious sickness in that time, which greatly affected Victoria and left her bedridden. Her mother downplayed her sickness and showed little sympathy for her weak daughter, despite Victoria's declining condition. Worse yet, Conroy saw his chance to strike in the weakened heir to the throne, and so pushed the sick young girl hard to appoint him as her secretary while he still had a chance. Backed by Victoria's mother, Conroy pestered the poor sick Victoria as she lay in bed, going as far as forcing paper and pencil into her hands and commanding her to sign. She refused, and although she recovered from her illness, the hatred of Conroy and her mother was now complete. As the king's health began to seriously deteriorate into 1836 and 1837, a dinner was held in which the king, the 17-year-old Victoria, and her mother all attended. Here, a famous dinner scene unfolded, where the king rose at the head of the table to give a speech in front of many guests. During this speech, he expressed his desire that he should live for 9 more months, so that the crown would pass to Victoria directly without the need for a regency from the Duchess of Kent, who he claimed was surrounded by evil advisors. Many were appalled, and the Duchess embarrassed, but nevertheless, on the issue the king would be successful. Victoria attained her majority on May 24, 1837, eliminating the need for a regency. 1 month later, Victoria's uncle, the old King William IV, died. The Archbishop and Lord Conyngham traveled to Kensington at 5 a.m., where they demanded to see Victoria, who was awoken and led down the stairs by her mother. She was informed that she was now the Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. After years of suppression under the Kensington system, she was now freed, and a new exciting and difficult chapter of Victoria's life had begun. Victoria, after briefly bereaving the loss of her uncle King William, prepared for her future as queen, although she was only a girl of 18 at the time. There were many within the kingdom who looked forward to her accession, and her youth and beauty offered a clear distinction from the previous reigns of her old and afflicted uncles. Her uncle William IV had certainly had positive aspects to his reign and personality, but towards the end of his life he had become a grumpy invalid old man. George IV, for the most part, was detested for the entirety of his reign and perhaps even his life by the populace. Therefore, Victoria came to the throne with a hopeful country behind her, ready to accept her youthful inexperience, at least for the time being. Unfortunately, it would not take long for the honeymoon phase to wear off between the country and the young queen, as we will see. Although she had kept in contact with her uncle Leopold, to whom she owed a great deal, the letters he wrote instructing and preparing her for her new role would of course not be sufficient in the long run. As many young monarchs in British history had experienced in the centuries past, Victoria would proverbially be thrown to the wolves and learn quick and hard lessons. She held her first council where she was said to have carried herself very well and proper, and one of her first actions was to command that her legal first name, Alexandrina, be officially removed from her name and titles and never used again. She met with her first prime minister, a man who would play a large, perhaps fatherly role in her immediate future, Lord Melbourne. Leopold, of course, as the King of Belgium, had his own axes to grind, and so communicated to his new queen niece through a man named Baron Christian Frederick Stockmar. However, although there was many changes that came about as a result of Victoria coming to the throne, the biggest shift that Victoria experienced immediately was the change in the relationship with her mother. Victoria was finally in a position to free herself from the jailer who had kept her in such isolation in the years past, and that is exactly what she did. She removed her bed from her mother's room on the first day and dismissed Sir John Conroy immediately. She denied her mother access to her apartments, denied her access to the title of Queen Mother, and required her to request permission to be granted an audience with her daughter, which was often denied. This treatment would not last forever, as the pair would reconcile over time, but Victoria's retribution was harsh initially, and understandably so. Nevertheless, Victoria would feel a degree of guilt later in life when remembering these interactions with her mother, especially after her mother had died. But at this time early on in her reign, she was ready to break free from her overbearing mother and was resentful of the treatment she had endured in years past. Victoria's relationship with her first prime minister was a strong one, and it is unsurprising that a young and mostly inexperienced queen of 18 relied so heavily on a 58-year-old political veteran. Melbourne was said to have done well with the queen and taught her necessary lessons that would be needed for her to be successful in her role in government. But Melbourne was a Whig, and thus the queen unsurprisingly became a Whig as well, at least for the time being. This is where the first seeds of a scandal began to be sown for Victoria, as she began to surround herself almost exclusively with Whig ladies. This will come up again shortly. Victoria was crowned on June 28, 1838, at Westminster Abbey in a long and grand coronation. After Victoria had aged out of her doll collection as she grew, animals had replaced the dolls and had become her companions of choice. In January 1833, Dash, a King Charles Spaniel, had been given to her by the detested Sir John Conroy. Victoria loved this dog and often dressed him up in a jacket and trousers. She was said to have rushed up the stairs to her room after arriving home from her coronation and coronation celebrations in order to give Dash a bath. The country was still beaming towards the new queen, but unfortunately it would not take long for discontent and anger to grow towards the young monarch. Her difficult relationship with her mother began to be gossiped about, and the influence of her foreign uncle Leopold began to give many cause to suspect that the queen was being influenced by foreign interests. Furthermore, Victoria's governess in her youth, the German Leitzin, was still around, and Victoria continued to rely on her for many things. Thus, a murmur of concern, or perhaps anger, began to arise throughout London. Victoria attempted to remedy this by sending her uncle Leopold's agent in Britain, Stockmar, away, and declined to help Leopold himself in foreign conflicts that he was engaged in, but this did not fully quiet the criticism. Unfortunately, a scandal broke out that was to greatly deteriorate the Queen's reputation with the populace. This was known as the Flora Hastings affair. Although Victoria had distanced herself from her mother, the Duchess was still living at Buckingham, and two rival courts emerged under the same roof, one for Victoria and one for her mother. Lady Flora Hastings was a 32-year-old lady-in-waiting for Victoria's mother, a possible spy, and part of a well-known, powerful Tory family, Tories being the political rivals of the Whigs. Victoria and her close ally and former governess, Leitzin, noticed a difference in the shape of Flora Hastings' stomach and came to the conclusion that Flora was surely pregnant and that none other than Sir John Conroy was the father. This was, of course, all gossip and an incorrect speculation, but whispers of this gossip began to spread quickly. In fact, Lady Flora was not pregnant. She was ill and suffering from an enlarged liver. Due to the false rumors that were blackening her name, Flora Hastings submitted herself to a medical examination, at which point it was determined that she was indeed not pregnant. Victoria was quick to realize the mess that she had created and attempted to remedy this by apologizing to Flora, but it was too late. Flora's powerful family were enraged at her treatment, and so, aided by Sir John Conroy, published the scandal in the papers. Victoria's mother also attempted to gain sympathy and further Victoria's unpopularity by revealing the perceived mistreatment that she was enduring from her daughter as well. This had a devastating effect on Victoria's reputation, as the populace now became convinced that the new queen had a cruel nature, which she exhibited towards not only Lady Flora, but her own mother as well. This not only had a negative effect on the queen, but Melbourne as well, as he and his government were also attacked viciously. Unfortunately for Victoria, Melbourne's government was shortly thereafter defeated, and he was forced to resign. This was disastrous news for the young queen, as she had come to rely heavily on her older, wiser, and more experienced prime minister. Melbourne's resignation unfortunately led right into another scandal for Victoria, known as the bedchamber crisis. After a tearful goodbye with Melbourne, Victoria was forced to meet with who was intended to be his successor, a Tory man named Robert Peel. Historically, a new prime minister would typically appoint new gentlemen at a king's court, but in the case of a queen, the precedent was not yet well defined. Of course, Peel, looking to form a Tory government, wanted assurance that the Queen supported him, and so asked that she replace the Whig ladies that she had surrounded herself with, as they were all married to members of Peel's opponents in government. Victoria, against constitutional convention, referred the matter to the outgoing Prime Minister Melbourne, who supported her efforts against Peel. In the end, Victoria refused to remove any of her ladies, and Peel then declined to form a government. Melbourne and the Whigs returned, and this would be the last time a British monarch blocked the formation of a government due to their own scruples. This action only furthered the public disdain for the young queen. Furthermore, the Flora Hastings affair had not yet reached its climax. Mrs. Hastings' condition began to deteriorate rapidly, although Victoria and Melbourne remained quite unsympathetic towards her struggles. Victoria finally realized the severity of the situation after it became clear that Flora would not survive, and attempted to reconcile with the dying woman, but it was too late. Flora died in July 1839 at 33 years of age, with an autopsy revealing that she had a tumor on her liver, which most likely led to her death. The press attacked the Queen once more, and it seemed that the young Victoria had reached the pinnacle of her public disdain. It was at this time that serious discussions began to be had about Victoria marrying. Victoria was generally opposed to an arranged marriage, and wished to find a man that lived up to her physical and masculine standards, a love match, if you will. But prior to the death of William IV, Victoria's uncle, King Leopold of Belgium, had arranged for some of his Saxe-Coburg nephews, cousins to Victoria, to visit England. These were the sons of Leopold and Victoria's mother's elder brother, Ernest of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. One of the sons, Albert, who we remember had one of the same midwives that Victoria had had at her birth, at his birth as well, had been being groomed to be Victoria's consort from an early age. Although William IV had had different ideas on who Victoria should be marrying, nothing prevented Victoria's Coburg cousins from visiting England, which they had done prior to William IV's death in 1836. Victoria's interaction with Albert and his brother in 1836 was a positive one, and she greatly enjoyed their visit. But this interaction she had with Albert was nothing like the interaction she would have with Albert in 1839 when he and his brother visited a second time. Albert had developed much in the previous years, and as soon as Victoria laid eyes on him, she fell head over heels in love with her cousin. This was all well and good because Albert was set on attaining a marriage with her on this visit or never at all. In fact, he believed that this could possibly be the last time he interacted with his cousin, as he could not wait around for much longer to find a bride. Because Victoria was the reigning sovereign of Britain, Albert could not propose to her. Instead, it would have to be Victoria who proposed to him, and this is exactly what happened. On Tuesday, October 15th, Victoria summoned Albert to her blue closet, where she proposed to him with Albert accepting. With the formalities out of the way, Albert took the young queen into his arms, and the pair began to blissfully express their love for each other. Despite their differences in personality and background, the marriage between Victoria and Albert would prove to be one of the greater matches made in British royal history. Victoria was distraught not only at Albert's return home in November of that year, but also by the government's attempts to limit Albert's prestige and income. Victoria wanted Albert to be made king consort, but Melbourne ruled this out. Nevertheless, Albert returned to England, and the couple were married in February 1840. Of course, Victoria and Albert remained intimate and affectionate with each other, but a new dawn was upon Victoria and her establishment, as after the marriage, Albert began to influence his wife tremendously. Victoria had developed a temper and had become quite possessive of the men that she held dear, the first of which had been Melbourne, who she often complained about having to share. With Albert, this possessiveness was even more intense. Furthermore, Albert set about trying to contain Victoria's temper by trying to coach her through her so-called quote-unquote storms, as her tantrums were often referred to. There was also an odd dynamic at play here. Victoria was sovereign and Queen of Britain, but she was married to a man who expected to be the head of the household. In this, there was a need for submission from someone, and Victoria was ultimately the one who submitted to her husband. Albert immediately set about removing two of Victoria's greatest influences, Lord Melbourne and Baroness Lehzen, who still remained in Victoria's household and continued to be a close confidant of the Queen. This was aided by the fact that Victoria almost immediately became pregnant, something that she was very angry about. She loved her relationship with Albert, the emotional relationship and support, and of course, the physical relationship that goes along with being married. She, however, detested what she called the quote-unquote shadow side of marriage, which was her nickname for pregnancy. Although we will not go into deep detail about Victoria's relationship with all of her children, it is important here to stop and discuss Victoria's mindset towards many of the children she would have over the years, as her experiences were not all positive, nor were they all negative. Victoria often teetered between being a gushing, over-anxious and loving mother and a scornful, cold, and distant mother. This, of course, is something that morphed over the years and decades as she grew as a wife and individual and matured, but it is important to note that despite the many great things she did for her children and grandchildren, there were also many unfortunate actions she took towards her children as well. One must also keep in mind that this was the 19th century, and so there is also a difference that needs to be noted between parenting practices in general in that time versus parenting practices that are generally accepted today. She was certainly not a fan of children in their first 6 months, as she called them ugly and frog-like, but as they aged, her attitude towards them changed dramatically. Victoria's relationship with her children would wax and wane, as at times she found them a disappointment, where at other times she found them a joy and a source of great pride. Victoria's first pregnancy gave Albert the chance he needed to increase his power within the household and in general. As she lay pregnant, Albert was made to take on more and more responsibility with sending dispatches and essentially worked his way into becoming her private secretary, oftentimes representing her in council meetings. In November 1840, the Princess Royal Victoria, who would be nicknamed Vicky, was born. Melbourne was defeated in the 1841 election and was replaced, this time successfully, by Robert Peel, who Victoria now began to become more fond of as a result of Albert's influence, and who avoided the same issue over the ladies of the bedchamber so as to not bring forth another bedchamber crisis. Melbourne was out, to Albert's joy, but Baroness Leighton would take a little more force to remove from Victoria's company. In the end, Albert convinced Victoria that it was Leighton's fault that she and her mother had had such a terrible relationship, and that Leighton had essentially brainwashed her into believing that her mother was out to get her. This was certainly false, as Victoria's mother had done many things to harm her in her youth, but Victoria was fully hitched to Albert's wagon at this point, and so followed his lead. Furthermore, Leighton was in charge of the royal nursery, and little Vicky had become ill, which Albert, of course, blamed on Leighton, although it should be noted that Leighton was not in charge of running the day-to-day operation of the nursery. Victoria was finally persuaded to send her lifelong companion away, which made Albert's hold on his wife complete. Leighton left without saying goodbye in order to not cause a scene, but Victoria was not fully convinced of her guilt and continued to hold her in high regard for the remainder of her life, often corresponding with her regularly until her death. The Queen was very angry again when she found out that she was pregnant for a second time. This time she would be delivered a boy in November 1841, who was named Albert Edward. This child, who would eventually be nicknamed Bertie, would endure perhaps the worst of his mother's criticisms throughout his life, and his long time as heir would certainly not be easy. He, of course, being the eldest male child, became the heir apparent to the crown. Unfortunately, he would not live up to the standards of his parents, especially his mother's, and the age-old tradition of Hanoverian monarchs being at odds with their eldest sons and heirs was unfortunately continued. That is not to say that Victoria did not speak highly of her son at times. She did throughout her life, but generally speaking, the Queen often found her heir an annoyance or an abomination, especially for one specific event which we will discuss shortly. Although Victoria considered pregnancy the so-called shadow side of marriage, which pulled her away from her beloved husband, she and Albert would go on to have a total of 9 children together. In addition to Princess Vicky and Prince Edward, 7 more children would be delivered between 1843 and 1857. They would include Princess Alice, who would go on to marry Louis IV, Grand Duke of Hesse, Prince Alfred, who would eventually become the Duke of Edinburgh and subsequently the Duke of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, Princess Helena, who would marry Prince Christian of Schleswig-Holstein, Princess Louise, who would go on to marry the Duke of Argyll, Prince Arthur, who would go on to become the Duke of Connaught and Strathearn, Prince Leopold, who would go on to become the Duke of Albany, but who would suffer from hemophilia his entire life, and lastly, Princess Beatrice, who would go on to marry Prince Henry of Battenberg. Although all of Victoria's children will not be discussed in detail, it should be noted that these children, through their marriages and children, would go on to create a dynasty which would have a serious impact on many of the royal families throughout the world. This is something that will come up again towards the end of Victoria's story. As Victoria's domestic life blossomed, and she and Albert continued their happy life as a married couple, changes continued to take place, especially when it came to Albert gaining further influence and power. This was especially evident in the day-to-day running of Victoria's royal household, which was at the time being run very inefficiently. Security was lax, servants were being wasteful, and the overall management of tasks was abysmally controlled. Albert famously pointed this out when referencing the process to start a fire in the household. He claimed that the fire was to be laid by the Lord Steward, but lit by the Lord Chamberlain, illustrating that nothing could get done without some sort of headache. Thus, the red tape of it all was torn away by Albert, and he focused on cleaning house by utilizing efficiency and common sense. He also tightened the rules and etiquette at court so that the court became more formal and proper. Game tables were removed and wine began to be rationed so as to set a proper moral example for the world. Victoria, for the time being, focused on being a good mother, and this time spent with her beloved husband and children was said to have included some of her happiest days. Her popularity grew from Albert's reforms, despite the fact that 2 assassination attempts in public caused great concern. The family withdrew from London to Windsor, and eventually an even more rural setting was desired by the Queen and her family. They found it on the Isle of Wight, where Osborne House was purchased and began to be updated. Victoria's life seemed to be all well in order, with a happy marriage, healthy children, and a nation that was in support of her once again. But dark clouds were on Victoria's horizon, and she was soon to experience one of the greatest losses of her life. Political issues began to arise around 1845 in Britain, related to an array of issues. Firstly, the so-called Corn Laws, which had been passed in 1815, was having a detrimental effect on the country as it prevented the importation of cheaper grain products, which caused prices to increase. In 1846, the Prime Minister Peel went against his party's wishes and led a repeal of the Corn Laws with his Whig opponents, but this ultimately cost him his position, and his ministry ultimately fell because of it. Furthermore, the so-called Great Famine in Ireland began in 1845, which came about due to a potato blight which caused crop harvests to fail and widespread starvation to kill hundreds of thousands. Victoria was, by this point, removed to a degree from the political sphere as she was still in the process of conceiving and delivering her children. The loss of Peel was felt greatly by Victoria, as she had warmed considerably to him during his time as Prime Minister. She was also greatly disturbed by the horror of the information that was flowing from Ireland related to the famine. She visited Ireland in 1849, but there was little that she could do as a queen with declining power within government. Ireland was a changing entity, and although she was welcomed by many within her western realm, there was certainly an undertone of rebellion that existed in the shadows that would of course become more prevalent as the decades passed. There was still even more serious problems to come, at least when considering Victoria's position as queen. The so-called revolutions of 1848 began to sweep across Europe, which saw many major monarchical powers being contested or even removed in favor of more democratic societies. Many kingdoms were affected, including France, Austria, Hanover, Bavaria, Prussia, and many more. Britain, however, was one of the few powers that stood strong against these revolutionary measures. As a side note here, it is important to note that Victoria was a Hanoverian monarch of Britain, and historically, Hanover and Britain had been ruled in a personal union since the reign of the first Hanoverian monarch, George I. Victoria's grandfather, George III, had been elevated from Elector of Hanover to King of Hanover prior to his death, and thus Victoria's uncles, George IV and William IV, had been kings of Hanover as well. However, Hanover practiced Salic law, meaning that only males could inherit the kingdom. Thus, when Victoria came to power in 1837, the kingdom of Hanover was transferred to her uncle, Ernest, former Duke of Cumberland, younger brother to her father, thus ending the personal union between Hanover and Britain. Although Britain remained as one of the kingdoms that stood firm against revolutionary measure, this did not mean that there were not attempts to bring forth such change at home. The so-called Chartists, named for the national protest movement known as the People's Charter in Britain, held a large meeting on Kennington Common in order to attempt to demand change. Luckily, it was not well organized and eventually petered out, despite the fact that thousands of people attended. In 1848, the almost 30-year-old Victoria visited a place in Scotland known as Balmoral. She sincerely loved visiting Scotland, and Balmoral was a residence that specifically caught her and Albert's eye. Balmoral would eventually be purchased by the pair in 1852, and this residence would be significantly updated to the point that it became one of Victoria's main residences for the rest of her life. In fact, it remains as one of the main residences of the British royal family to this day. But the early 1850s were important in Britain, and indeed in Victoria's personal life, for another reason, due to the fact that a major project had been envisioned and taken on by Albert. In early 1850, he presided over the first meeting of commissioners who would oversee the implementation of an exhibition that Albert hoped would take place in Britain the following year. This exhibition's purpose would be to show off new industrial processes from around the world and thus increase Britain and he and Victoria's prestige in the process. A grand building of cast iron and plate glass was commissioned in order to house this event, which could serve as a monument to the patronage of art and industry. This building would eventually become famously known as the Crystal Palace, which would unfortunately be destroyed in 1936. In May 1851, the so-called Great Exhibition took place, which lasted until October of the same year. Victoria traveled to the exhibition in an open carriage almost daily and perused up and down the aisles until she returned to Osborne in July. This was a proud moment for Victoria, but it was an especially proud moment for her husband Albert. Unfortunately, this would be perhaps the pinnacle of Albert's popularity in Britain, as unfortunate changes began to take place shortly thereafter. The Crimean War broke out between Russia and the Ottoman Empire, where Britain supported the Ottomans. Albert was accused of pursuing pro-German policy and was viciously attacked in the press. Furthermore, Albert began to become a slave to his work, which often saw him copying endless documents on his wife's behalf to see the flow of government continuing smoothly. This, as one would expect, had a serious detrimental effect on his relationship with the Queen and indeed his health. Albert continued to attempt to keep his wife in check, but found the Queen becoming ever more agitated throughout the duration of the Crimean War and her last pregnancies. Victoria, despite her limitations, did what she could to aid in the war effort, which included traveling to military hospitals and demanding better treatment for wounded soldiers. She was also keen on providing medals for acts of bravery during the war, and was keen on awarding them to soldiers herself. This is where the so-called Victoria Cross traces its origins. The Victoria Cross is the highest and most prestigious decoration in the British honor system to date, and since 1856 has only been issued 1,358 times. The Crimean War was won in 1856, and her last child was delivered in 1857. By December 1860, Victoria was celebrating a glorious Christmas season with Albert and her children at Windsor. Little did she know that this would be the last Christmas she would enjoy for the foreseeable future. In March 1861, Victoria's previously estranged mother, the Duchess of Kent, died with Victoria's hand in hers. Although the pair had feuded after Victoria had become queen, as the years had passed, mother and daughter reconciled to a degree, which made the Duchess's loss even more difficult to bear. The Duchess's death brought forth great sorrow and regret for Victoria, as she lamented the way she had treated her mother in her early years as queen, although when remembering the experiences her mother put her through in her youth, perhaps this regret was unwarranted. Unfortunately for Victoria, the worst was yet to come. As discussed previously, Albert had been fully immersed in his work, and as he continued to work his fingers to the bone, his health began to be affected. He began to suffer from frequent stomach attacks and sickness, which oftentimes included so-called melancholy, aka depression. Albert had worked hard to instill the values he thought necessary in his son and heir, Bertie, but the young prince, 20 years old in 1861, had not lived up to the standards that his parents had set for him. He seemed to be displaying many of the negative traits that his mother displayed, or worse yet, traits of her Hanoverian uncles of decades past. Victoria, for her part, seemed to be Bertie's biggest critic, and did not think very highly of her heir apparent. Unfortunate news reached Victoria and Albert from Ireland, where Bertie was spending the summer with the Grenadier Guards at Curragh Camp. Bertie had, unwisely, engaged in a sexual affair with a woman named Nellie Clifton, which was beginning to leak abroad. Bertie's parents were appalled by their son's behavior, especially Albert, who began to lose faith in his son. The potential for scandal or blackmail was high, and this greatly disturbed the Queen and her consort. Still recovering from a sickness that he had not been able to throw off, Albert set out to continue his business and to meet Bertie to discuss the affair. When he and Bertie met at Cambridge, where the prince had traveled, it was said that they took a long walk in the rain to hash out the matter. Although Albert was satisfied with the conversation, when he returned to London, he was very ill and weak to the point that he could barely even hold his pen. Given his melancholy nature, he was sure that he would die, and unfortunately, he was right. His condition declined as friends and family anxiously waited for the sickness to possibly pass, but through bouts of delirium, sleeplessness, and severe pain, he finally settled in the so-called Blue Room at Windsor, where he inched ever closer to death. Victoria, beside herself with despair, could do nothing but watch as her whole world was slowly pulled away from her one breath at a time. On December 14, 1861, surrounded by his children and wife, Albert breathed his last. The Queen was carried from the room in a state of desperation and shock, and it was clear that a new age had dawned in Victorian Britain. The Queen was now on her own and once again alone in her role as Queen. But the shock and despair that Victoria experienced with her mother and Albert's death would prove to be too much for the 42-year-old Queen to endure. Her mourning, and the things that she would do to express her mourning, would be famously remembered for generations to come. The room in which Albert died was photographed and kept exactly as it had been. She continued to have his clothes laid out for him each day. She slept with his nightshirt and kept a cast of his hand close to her bed at all times. The color choice for the Queen's future, black, and a lot of it. The mourning Queen was so devastated by the loss of Albert that she would incredibly wear black for the remainder of her life. Before she left for Osborne from Windsor, she traveled a short distance to Frogmore, where her mother had been laid to rest, and chose a spot for a grand mausoleum for Albert, which she hoped would soon hold her as well. Her displays of sorrow were great, but this was unfortunately only the beginning of what was to come. The Queen lost weight, at least initially, suffered headaches, experienced regular depression, and wished daily for her life to end. She began to refuse to see her ministers, as any pressure related to business when she was in the state of grief could not be endured. Victoria also lashed out at the Prince of Wales, who she began to blame for Albert's death. In her mind, it was Bertie's actions related to the Nellie Clifton affair which killed the man she had loved so much. In reality, Albert had died of typhoid, but nevertheless, Bertie's relationship with his mother was irreparably damaged during this time. The Queen began to withdraw from society, from public life, and from her public duties as Queen. This was not only due to her grief, but also due to the fact that Victoria had relied so heavily on Albert and was now well in over her head when it came to the business of government. Victoria's withdrawing from public affairs was to become extremely damaging to her public reputation. It was part of her duty as a constitutional monarch to not only do private work, which was her responsibility, but also to handle the duties that were required of her in public. The populace knew that the Queen was paid for in part by them, and they expected to have something to show for it. Although initially Victoria's mourning greatly increased her popularity, this was before everyone was aware that the Queen would turn to a life of full seclusion. A recluse Queen that rarely, if ever, showed her face was not going to form a good working relationship with her people in the long term. Victoria began to spend more and more time at Osborne on the Isle of Wight and at Balmoral in Scotland, refusing to open Parliament and putting weight back on as she ate and drank to deal with her sorrows. However, it was here in Scotland that the next, rather interesting male figure would enter the picture. For some time, Victoria and Albert had had male servants, or gillies, that attended to them while they were at Balmoral. One of them was a man named John Brown, who had begun to grow in the Queen's affections over the years. By 1863, the 39-year-old Brown began to show up in the Queen's journals frequently, and it was clear that he had become the favorite of all of her servants. So much the favorite was he that Victoria decided that Brown would leave with her when she left Scotland. He eventually traveled to Osborne and began to wait on the Queen indefinitely. Brown was a rough around the edges Scot who drank and smoked often, even in Victoria's presence, and was said to have been, all in all, quite brash and poorly spoken. It was not long before he was taking orders from the Queen only, and he was quickly granted promotion after promotion, which of course did neither his nor Victoria's reputation any good. Victoria was, nonetheless, concerned by her enjoyment of Brown's company due to the fact that it seemed to be lightening the burdensome grief that she had been experiencing over the loss of Albert. For this, she felt guilty. There, of course, were rumors that Brown was Victoria's lover, and even that the Queen had become pregnant with his child. However, although it can never be known the true extent of Victoria's relationship with John Brown, the pregnancy rumors were simply gossip, as the Queen in 1866 was now well on her way to 50. Brown would remain a faithful servant to the Queen until 1883, when he died at the age of 56 from skin disease. The Queen was devastated by his loss and erected a memorial to her favorite servant at Balmoral, but in the 1860s, his death was still off in the distance. The 1860s was a time of major change for Victoria, and one of the most serious changes took place in 1865. Her uncle Leopold, the man who was responsible for making sure she had been raised in England, who had played such a large part in setting up the marriage to Albert, and who had been an all-around ally and guiding figure in her life, died. She was now, for all intents and purposes, the head of the family, and the family that she was head of was ever growing and becoming more and more powerful. Her children had begun to be married off, and her bloodline spread throughout the royal families across all of Europe. But for the time being, she was still a withdrawn, private recluse, and this would unfortunately need to change. Enter two of Victoria's most famous ministers. Politics had waxed and waned in the time since the death of Albert. Ministries had come and gone, but in the 1860s, two men emerged from the political landscape that the Queen would interact with often, but in completely different ways. The first was a man named Benjamin Disraeli, who, in short, was a Tory politician who the Queen would love. The second was a man named William Gladstone, a Whig politician who the Queen would come to detest. Victoria still was surrounded by mostly liberal Whig individuals, and not much had changed in her mind when it came to politics. But by 1866, she finally found herself ready to open Parliament again and to perhaps re-enter public life as well. This was aided by international tension and the calls for further reform of the government, the first serious rounds of reform being passed in 1832 during the reign of William IV. With governments falling and ministers attempting to unsuccessfully form coalitions in order to form a successful ministry, the conservative Benjamin Disraeli found his ascendancy and became Prime Minister in 1868. Victoria had not liked Disraeli in her youth, but he had slowly begun to win her affections with the tried and true method of flattery. Disraeli made it seem as if he would defer to his queen the major decisions that came up during the course of ruling the kingdom, while he would handle smaller issues, and thus in essence, Victoria could feel that she and he together were running the country. Victoria felt that Disraeli was simply a devoted servant who needed her, the powerful sovereign, which was similar to how Melbourne had handled Victoria in her early time as queen. In reality, this was a farce. Behind the scenes, Disraeli was skillfully managing the queen with flattery and illusion, while he ultimately made serious decisions. Unfortunately, Disraeli's government fell the same year, and Victoria was forced to accept William Gladstone as her prime minister. Gladstone could have perhaps become a favorite of the Queen's, as they had interacted positively when Albert lived and agreed on many things, but Gladstone was no Disraeli and ignored the necessity of playing into Victoria's need to feel important and useful. Gladstone, in contrast to Disraeli, made Victoria feel inadequate and was much more confrontational towards the Queen than Dizzy, as Disraeli had been nicknamed by Victoria. Gladstone also had more radical tendencies and desires, like disestablishing the Protestant Church in Ireland in order to stop the rising Republican and terrorist movements that were growing there. Although Victoria wanted this as well, she would never consider breaking her coronation oath to protect the Protestant Church, and so Queen and Prime Minister found themselves at odds with one another, a common theme between the two. The dislike of Gladstone continued to grow into near hatred, as Gladstone roughly handled his queen with little finesse. In 1870, the Franco-Prussian War broke out, and the Queen was suspected of pushing pro-Prussian biases, although England officially remained neutral. This, mixed with their continuing seclusion, brought forth a wave of republicanism, as many were under the impression that it would be better to have a president who cost significantly less than to have a more expensive monarch that they never saw. The Queen's advisors, along with Gladstone, tried to draw her out of seclusion, but it would be the heir Bertie who would put an end to the Republican pushes. He, like his father, contracted typhoid and was ill on the anniversary of his father's death. Victoria, although never having a good relationship with her son, was said to have been very concerned for him and rushed to his bedside. Luckily, the Prince of Wales recovered, and this brought forth a resurgence in sympathy for the Queen that destroyed the Republican movements. Furthermore, she began to attend some public functions, which put her back into the public sphere. Gladstone's government fell in 1874, at which point Disraeli returned to office as Prime Minister to Victoria's glee. Disraeli had kept in contact with Victoria during his time in opposition, and Victoria was ever more delighted in his way of handling affairs. In 1858, spurred on by the troubles between India and the East India Trading Company, India was transferred to the Crown. This gave Victoria an opportunity to be declared Queen Empress in 1876, the Empress title of course only being applicable in India, and Disraeli greatly assisted her in achieving this, to the despair and anger of many. This was, for the most part, a keeping up with the Joneses type moment, as the King of Prussia had recently become an emperor, which meant that Victoria's eldest daughter Vicky, who was married to the emperor's son, would eventually become an empress herself. Thus, Victoria was able to stay at a minimum on even keel with her children when it came to precedence, and soon began signing herself VRI, Victoria Regina et Imperatrix. Unfortunately, Disraeli's second time as Prime Minister would come to an end with the Bulgarian Uprising of 1876 and the subsequent Batak Massacre and Russo-Turkish War that followed. Gladstone, 67 years old and sick, roused himself once again from retirement to enter politics at the center stage, and in 1880 Disraeli's government was defeated. Victoria was forced to yet again have Gladstone, who she had began to detest, as Prime Minister. Disraeli died in 1881, but Gladstone would hang around for 17 more years. Gladstone would be defeated and come back again 2 more times, once in 1886 and once in 1892, to be a thorn in Victoria's political side before he finally retired for good and died. Each time, Victoria found accepting him as Prime Minister even more difficult than the time before, as he continued to handle his relationship with the Queen roughly. Nevertheless, he has gone down in history for the many interactions he has had with the Queen during his many bouts as Prime Minister. As time moved on, Victoria began to take on full force her role as the head of the family, which was continuously growing. She still fluctuated, as she had in her youth, from worrying and doting on her children and grandchildren to criticizing and detesting their behavior at times. Her relationship with her heir Bertie was gradually improving as well, from the all-time low after Albert had died years earlier. He certainly still annoyed her often, especially when it came to his vices, which included gambling, smoking, racing, and associating with groups that she disapproved of like Americans, but all in all, she was slowly warming to her heir. Even so, she would not allow him to take part in any business whatsoever, despite Bertie's desire to do so. In the previous years, the Queen had worked to get all of her children married off to proper spouses, and the grandchildren began to multiply exponentially as the years went by. Her family of 9 children and 42 grandchildren had become a dynasty, and her grandchildren would eventually sit on the thrones of Germany, Russia, Norway, Spain, Sweden, Romania, and Greece. She eventually began to be affectionately referred to by her grandchildren as Gan-Gan, and she took this role seriously, going as far as sitting at the bedsides of some of her female grandchildren while they were giving birth, attempting to help ease their pain and suffering. One of these grandchildren was her granddaughter through her daughter Alice, who gave birth to the future mother of Prince Philip, consort of Elizabeth II. Victoria wrote to her family often, giving advice, instructing them on how to handle affairs, and immersing herself in her role as the head of the family. Furthermore, her public persona finally emerging once again from the darkness of her seclusion, brought forth great popularity once again for the aging Queen. After the Republican movements had been squashed, the Queen began to be seen more and more in public, and the memory of the reclusive widow faded into the background. Today, Victoria is often remembered as a cold and distant monarch, and many today are quick to cite the snarky phrase which she was supposed to have said, "We are not amused." However, there were in fact many reports of the old Queen enjoying time as the matriarch of a growing family. She was said to have laughed and smiled often while enjoying the crowds that greeted her when she traveled. She also began to travel abroad more, which included a trip to the south of France. She was said to have enjoyed the French Riviera immensely and returned 8 more times after her first visit. Although there was still life left to live for the old queen, unfortunately, as one could imagine, her health was deteriorating as well. The last chapter of the long, successful story that was Victoria's life was at hand. Victoria had suffered a fall in the years past, and this had given her a lameness that was near impossible for her to overcome. Although she did not return to her reclusive ways, public travel became more difficult after her fall, as she experienced bouts of pain in multiple areas of her body. She also began to go blind to the point that her handwriting became illegible. However, old age was to bring forth even more difficult experiences than anything she had experienced physically. The numbers of family members and friends lost to war or illness began to mount, and some of her children and grandchildren began to die off. Of her children, Alice died in 1878 and Leopold in 1884, along with certain spouses of her children as well. Of course, by the late 1880s, we remember that John Brown and Benjamin Disraeli were gone by this point as well. Despite the mental trauma that came with these deaths, the old queen did not stop working, and it was in the 1890s that an interesting individual entered the fray. Victoria had always detested racial prejudice and had recently found the company of 2 Indian servants quite enjoyable. One of them in particular she favored the most, a man named Abdul Karim, known as the Munshi. Karim began to grow in the queen's affections and soon found himself promoted and working exclusively with the queen, which was similar to the way she had treated John Brown. Even in old age, the queen was looking for capable men to fill roles that she deemed appropriate. However, there was doubt about Karim's social origins, which mattered significantly in that time, but Victoria refused to hear of it and continued to keep Karim by her side. As those around her began to grow jealous of the favor that she showed to her Indian servant, everything came to a head in 1897 when Victoria's household refused to travel on her spring holiday in France if Karim went as well. Victoria was so enraged that she swept all of the contents off of her table onto the floor in a burst of anger that harkened to the days of her so-called storms in her youth. Karim did not go on the progress with them initially, but showed up later to Minnie's anger and disgust. However, Karim stepped over the line when he invited one of his proteges to come as well. Although Karim remained in the Queen's service, this action led to a decline in his influence over time. In September 1896, Victoria hit a benchmark in her reign, as she by that point had reigned longer than any other sovereign in British history, surpassing her grandfather's nearly 60-year reign. As the new century rolled around, Victoria could look back with pride at what she had accomplished, both politically and through her family. Unfortunately, there was not much time left for the aging queen. 2 unfortunate deaths set in motion the beginning of the end for Victoria. Her son, Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, died of throat cancer in 1900, which was followed by the death of her grandson, Prince Christian Victor, son of her daughter, Princess Helena, the same year. The old queen was distraught and depressed by these deaths and could not bear to continue on any longer. She began to eat less and experienced sleeplessness and serious stomach issues. By January 1901, she began to experience mental confusion and had difficulty speaking. The end was clearly at hand. In a semi-conscious state, she, still cognizant of her duty as sovereign, called for her son, the Prince of Wales, who had been the child who had perhaps disappointed her the most throughout her life. As the soon-to-be king entered the room, his dying mother opened her arms and embraced her son at last, whispering her final word, "Bertie." On January 22, 1901, surrounded by many of her children and grandchildren, Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland died. She was 81 years old and had reigned for nearly 64 years. News of her death spread quickly throughout the realm, as journalists rushed to be the first ones to deliver the news to the world. After a small service at St. George's Chapel at Windsor, her body was taken a short distance to the mausoleum at Frogmore. In her coffin, she laid not in black, but in white, for she was finally reunited with the man that had meant everything to her when he had lived. Victoria and Albert lie at the mausoleum at Frogmore to this day. The life and reign of Queen Victoria is an incredibly interesting reign to reflect upon. From her birth, it was expected that she would play an important role in the future of the British monarchy, and indeed her life proved this to be true. As she grew, she experienced many trials and tribulations, even in her youth, as attempts to use her for her position by her mother and advisors put the young queen to be in a difficult and vulnerable position. But once she became queen, the vein of iron that she has long been remembered for finally came to the forefront, and she, on her own admission, began to rule alone. But even with this stern and independent mindset, Victoria was helplessly in over her head and had to rely heavily on the powerful men that surrounded her. Her uncle Leopold, her prime ministers Melbourne, Peel, Disraeli, and of course, her beloved husband Albert. The happiest days of Victoria's life can be argued to have been in the company of said husband, despite the unfortunate experiences she would have with the so-called shadow side of marriage, aka pregnancy, and his death at a young age. The queen was not without scandal, and did not command the popularity that flowed to her at points during her life for the entirety of her reign. The bedchamber crisis, the Flora Hastings affair, her relationship with Albert at times, and the extended reclusive seclusion she withdrew to after Albert's death all brought forth great unpopularity for the anxious queen. She also can be criticized, at least in part, for her treatment of her children, although again one must understand that the times were different in the 19th century and that the queen also exhibited very loving and respectable traits as a mother in certain scenarios and at different times throughout her life. She, of course, should be praised for the things that reflect positively on her in the modern day, such as that of her detestation of racial prejudice, but it should also be noted that she also held beliefs that did not age well and reflect poorly if viewing from the context of modern values. Although we did not discuss this, Victoria was adamantly opposed to women's rights in her time, despite the fact that she ruled one of the most powerful kingdoms in the world as a woman herself. Perhaps the vein of iron that has been attributed to Victoria comes through too strongly today, for the "we are not amused" version of Victoria is often what one thinks about when remembering this queen of an age long gone. But Victoria played her part as the head of the international royal family quite well, and throughout her life, and especially in her old age, showed affection, concern, and love for those around her and her family. Queen Victoria remains as one of the longest reigning monarchs in British history, as the monarch who led Britain into a new age and century, as the last Hanoverian monarch of her country, and as a queen that left her stamp on royal history not only in Britain, but throughout Europe at large. For this, she will rightly go down in history as one of the greatest and most influential queens to ever rule the British Isles.